Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being part of our 8th webinar. I welcome you all. I would like to now start by introducing Pakistan Chalk Community Center, a space that was established to engage with arts and culture and the most important pressing queries around the built environment. The idea of Pakistan Chalk Community Center was always to collaborate and develop allies in the context of Karachi. But as time and as we've grown with these last few years, it's happened that Pakistan Chalk Community Center has found a lot of these research facilities where we've been collaborating across cities. And now this is the first time that Pakistan Chalk Community Center has established a platform where we have started these conversations and webinars with our neighboring cities and also talking about the pressing points around South Asia. I'm going to now introduce the project Plus 921 Heritage Talks, which is a project of Pakistan Chalk Community Center. This project is supposed to be, or visions or aims to have these webinar conversations every 6 months. The dialogue on heritage is, of course, a global conversation which must take into account the local context. In a rapidly changing world, the dialogue around heritage preservation is shaped by many and relatively new factors. The parameters of what constitutes heritage are expanding and take into account not just the past and the tangible heritage sites, but our present and as well as our current relationship with spaces we inhabit as communities. Pakistan Chalk Community Center aims to engage in a comprehensive dialogue on the above and many other questions that we've been asking around in the last few sessions that have taken place by bringing together architects, researchers, urban planners, policy makers, designers, artists, journalists, filmmakers, bloggers, and activists to brainstorm ideas for the protection and to create a dialogue around conservation, rehabilitation, and accessibilities of heritage sites and public spaces. Plus 921 Heritage Talks hopes to bring all kinds of stakeholders, allies, and counterpartners to think about the the idea of either adopting to uses in different situations or how built environment must think together. The advantage of these process includes breathing life into buildings that were left behind. However, these practices might be employed for the sake of preserving heritage, but to increase profitability of piece of land. These are some of the information that we have been come across for the last few years in my own practice. It's been thought out that heritage is considered in a very individual manner. And here we are thinking how to act together or think together or walk together. Now, today's topic is quite an interesting one, and I'm very excited to have my panelists to accept our invitation, we've been viewing their work from a distance. And now we finally have them here talking about their work and kind of reflecting upon the larger idea that we thought, what does it mean from learning from archives, walking and documenting? So just to discuss a little bit about the abstract of this topic, the idea of history as neatly categorized events which occur in linear chronological order is being greatly challenged in this day and age. The history passed through the official sources stored in books is a fraction of what has occurred. History is best explored through a multifaceted approach that challenges the historical narratives, and by doing so, a democratic process of documenting history. As learners and observers of history and heritage, it becomes imperative for us to not limit our observations and our methodologies. Perhaps this is where the independent practice of archiving comes in. So thank you so much for taking out time and being part of this webinar session. I now request Aksa to please introduce my panelists for today's session.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 8th webinar session. I shall be introducing our panelists for tonight. We have with us the Kochi Heritage Project, represented by Johan. The Kochi Heritage Project aims to stimulate the curious visitor to learn and carry away with them a deeper and broader understanding of the city's heritage, sufficient to enrich the mind and to cause them to pause and look at life from a new point of view and a new vision. We have with us Alex Strums, who is an Iranian-American writer and editor-in-chief of Ajam Media Collective. He's a PhD candidate of anthropology at the University of Chicago and has previously worked as a journalist. We have Amar Naqvi from Karachi. He is a freelance journalist who focuses on popular culture. He has been researching the food of Karachi for the past few years and runs food tours of the city called Khane Mein Kya Hai.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here in this session. And it's such a privilege to be here along with distinguished panelists and also everyone who's joined here. My name is Johan, and I am the founder of the Kochi Heritage Project. We are basically an organization that
Sorry,
is...
Juan, just before you start, the slider was on the screen, so I just wanted to request if you could move that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So we are basically an organization that is trying to promote heritage and create a dialogue around heritage in a city called Kochi, which is in the southern state of Kerala in India. And it's been about 4 years since I started this project. I'll just go through an entire brief about the project and basically what we do in this session. So to give you a background about Kochi, we are located right at the bottom of India. It's one of the southernmost states in India, and it's a beautiful place called Kerala, which is also known as God's own country. And Kochi is in a sort of historical city, but not a long history like other cities in India. But we have a history of about 700 years or so. At one point of time, there was a city called Muziris, which was a much more older city. And Kochi basically eclipsed that city at one point of time and replaced it. And Muziris was considered as one of the most premium emporium in India. It was the most premium market where one could come and trade in. So a lot of people from the east and the west used to come to this place called Muziris. And eventually, when Muziris got wiped out, Kochi replaced it, and Cochin became the queen of the Arabian Sea. So the history of Cochin actually begins only in the 14th century. It was an obscure little village on the banks of this lake called the Vembanad Lake, which is the largest lake in India, and largest freshwater lake in India. And Muziris was this ancient town that was trading for about 3 millennia with the Egyptians and Phoenicians, and there were Romans who came and settled in this place called Muziris. Trade was very active. The spice trade, of course, which was what was being traded from here. And people from the east and the west used to come and meet in this place called Muziris. And over time, Muziris fell out of place when other cities started growing in and around this area. And by 1341, there was a cataclysmic event that happened in the banks of this river called Periyar. So Periyar is a river that is flowing centrally through the state called Kerala. And I'm not sure, you might have heard about floods that happened in 2018 in Kerala. And something of a similar sort happened in 1341, but maybe 100 times more deadlier than that. And it changed the land formation in and around this area called Muziris. So Muziris was silted up because of the river, and another harbor was formed around 30 kilometers away from this place called Muziris. And it eventually opened up to be one of the most safest harbors in the world, and it was called Kochi. Kochi, and like the rest of the other places in India, like you see, were ruled by small kingdoms, and there was a ruling family called the Perumbadattu Sorupam, who actually migrated to this area and called themselves the Cochin royal family. And as of now, there is no royalty in India as such. It is only titular in most places, but in Cochin, they don't even follow that now. But with 1341, a new place called Kochi was formed, and this became like the centermost place of trade and transaction for spices in the world. So it eventually just eclipsed and overtook what Muziris was for what 2,000 to 3,000 years. Coming to the Kochi Heritage Project, so I grew up in the city and I'm very much part of the city. I have actually grown up in a lot of places, but eventually I found my way back to Kochi. And in 2018, I started this passion project documenting Kochi's history. In the beginning, it was just history, but eventually I wanted to cover heritage, and heritage has a lot of facets under it. So I started documenting history, art, architecture, food, places, and its people on this page on Instagram. And there wasn't a better place for me to reach out to a younger audience, because obviously they are our future. And Instagram was the place that I could find these people who I could interact with and talk about heritage, when there was absolutely nothing happening in Cochin at one point of time. And after a while I was documenting heritage, I started taking free public heritage walks with a group called Sahapedia, which was a pan-India non-government organization that was promoting heritage in almost all the cities in India. And this passion project was basically fueled by my travels in India and abroad, where I encountered individuals who were quite passionate about their cities and their places, and were promoting their place and the heritage, reaching towards an audience that didn't know anything about heritage or preservation or conservation. And so when I returned back to my city, I took it on myself to do the same in my city. For a while, I took free heritage walks, and afterwards, I responded to an ad on Facebook calling out for storytellers. And I thought, why not try it out? And I gave it a shot. I got selected for a travel company that has been following responsible tourism, promoting heritage and tourism in Kerala. And I became one of their storytellers for a while. Eventually, I wanted to take it a little more further, and that's when I started getting into more research. And you can't really put up anything online. I mean, you can put up anything online these days, but if you don't back it up with good research, it wouldn't make much sense to many people. So my love for my city forced me to move away from my job, and I started researching on the history and the heritage of my city. And I started with contemporary sources like your books that were written in the last 15 or 20 years, much like the one that you see on the screen now, which was a very recent book that was written by an author from my city, talking about the history and stories of my city. After which I started collecting stories from eyewitnesses. So once I started reading these books, I started getting inspired by many of the stories, and I started walking around on the streets on my own, cycling around, moving around, meeting people, talking to them about these old stories that I had read in these books. And while I tell them stories that I read in the book, I started getting more stories from other people who started responding to my stories. And there were many people who are eyewitnesses to many accounts, and there were many first-hand accounts, many people who are almost in their 70s and 80s, recollecting old stories that they've heard over their lifetime. And I started collecting these and started putting it on my Instagram account. And then I started examining heritage precincts around my city. So my daily schedule used to be waking up in the morning and then going out into places that are rich with heritage and talking to people, while at the same time I walk around heritage buildings and architecture and start looking out for clues and evidence of what I read, and trying to picturize or imagine how it would have been maybe 500 years before it. And eventually I had to find more work around these things that I started reading and finding out on the streets. And I started referencing out rare out-of-print books. So these were my best sources of getting authentic information online. And I don't have a background in history or heritage, so I had to start everything from scratch. So I didn't have accounts on JSTOR or get connected with university accounts. So I had to basically rely on Google itself. But eventually, I got friends up in places, and then they started sharing me documents and journals, and this became a very good source for me to compare what I was reading and seeing on ground with research that was being done by other scholars all around the world who came to my city and wrote about it. So online archival repositories like JSTOR and Academia, all of this really helped me, and also archives.org, which has an abundance of old books that can be downloaded, and many of them are not available in libraries anymore. And so these became my referencing point to find out more about history and my search for heritage in my city. Now, as of now, it's been about 4 years since I started doing it. And early in 2022, I started getting a lot of messages. This was post-COVID. I started getting a lot of messages on my Instagram page asking me to take walks, continue taking walks. So I was doing free walks until COVID happened. But then everything was shut, and there was nothing happening. But post-COVID, a lot of people started traveling around, and this included a lot of local people who were really interested about the heritage of their own city. And so in 2022, April 18th is considered as World Heritage Day, and we launched a campaign on April 18th to do heritage walks over the weekends in a span of a month's time. And May 18th is supposed to be World Museum Day, and we connected museums and heritage together during this time and started promoting heritage walks in the city. Around this time, I relaunched my page as a storytelling initiative, because what better way to learn history and heritage through stories? And so I started introducing storytelling tours based on themes that I found was common in many places. And these storytelling tours were a big hit in my city during that time. The turnouts for each walk to about 30 to 40 people coming around for each walk at that point of time. Eventually, I started curating heritage tours within Kochi and in different places. I started with one place, but then now I've moved on to 3-4 other places, trying to move the focus from not just a historical part of the city, but also other parts of the city that grew later on. Through these walks, I'm basically trying to create heritage awareness with people, young people actually, through these online campaigns that I do, and also offline campaigns like these walks that were launched during that time, trying to promote heritage in museums. At the same time, I continue my work, which I initially started, that was documenting what I was researching and finding on my Instagram page, but moving into more newer content like reels, which are again much more faster, able to reach people much more faster and more number of people, and trying to create awareness through education about heritage. As of now, I also take up heritage research work for individuals who want to find out about their family history. There are some organizations that came up to me who wanted to find out background research on many architectural, many buildings, many places in different parts of the city. And I also I launched these heritage events in the city. So our very first heritage event happened in December, just last month. And we had about 10 different walks featuring people who are not directly involved in heritage documentation, but they're actually doing work which is revolving around heritage. So we had something called a tree walk, where where people could come join in and learn more about their natural heritage. So trees are our natural heritage, and there was a person who was actively researching, passionately researching about trees in my city. And I thought, what better way to connect trees and people, in a space, in an event. So we had a tree walk. We had something called a type walk, where people could learn about different typefaces that evolved in the last 50 years or so. People who, sign painters who did a lot of artistic work back in the day, but now everything is being replaced by digital artwork. Um, um, so we had this special walk which was done by a calligraphy artist who actually spends his time learning and studying about typefaces that is not existing anymore. And I mean, it's slowly getting wiped out. We had a sketch walk with a group that actively sketches parts of the city on a weekly basis. They meet up every Saturday or Sunday and sketch places, which is basically documenting heritage space. And so, again, what better way to connect heritage and sketch artists? And this was again another interesting event that we launched. So similarly, we connected a lot of other events, and one of them was again a food walk. And food is something that unites people across religion, across communities. And the food walk that we launched was also received by people, well received by people. So I would continue doing such events again in the future. And that looks like the future of heritage education as I see it now. And it's always better to reach out to the younger audience now, because they are going to be our future. And which is why I'm investing a lot of effort in the Instagram page. And also I'm planning to start up YouTube, which is again another medium to reach out to people. So coming to my storytelling walks, which are basically my bread and butter as of now, and also the main thing that we do are storytelling walks. And in my storytelling walks, I don't just do history, because history is basically boring for a lot of people, and it's only a small percentage of people that really enjoys history. But if you add art, architecture, food, places, and people, and stories revolving around these places, it just makes history much more palatable for people. And I've noticed that many people who are really contemplating on joining many of these walks were really, they had really enjoyed doing the walk and wanted to do more walks after coming for a storytelling walk. And so these are basically sensory experiences where you actually see tangible things, at the same time meet with people, communicate with them. Like the image that you see, this is a lady that is actually selling papadums. So papadum is something that was not from our city. It was actually brought in by a community that migrated to the city 500 years ago. And this lady is from the last generation of these papadum makers who actually do it by hand, because many of this is being replaced by machines. And so there were these students who came in and they got to interact with this lady. She was well versed in English, because a lot of people come and see her, and she's learned English and other languages over time. And she was basically able to explain how this was made, rather than a guide going around and explaining about it. And so these are sensory experiences. So when you take a food tour, you're actually tasting many decades and years of that cuisine getting developed in a place. Sometimes, like in my city, where there are 35 different communities from 15 different who speak 15 different languages, and have settled here over the last 600, 700 years. And the kind of variety of food that they offer is totally different from what you generally find in many cities. And so what I basically do with these walks is trying to create an impact, not just for the visitors, but also to these papadum makers, like I said. So they also get to explain and talk about their heritage, while at the same time they're getting monetary benefits through these walks. People buy these papadums from them, That's just an example that I'm giving you. And it is also emphasizing the need for heritage conservation. So many of these people now, I'm coming up with a new experience where people can actually join in for a meal with the family um, who migrated here. And this has also brought up this dialogue and conversation with that family about the need to conserve this tradition that they've been following and to showcase it for their own generations who are now falling away from this or are really not interested in many of this. So it is helping the locals first, and also people who are coming to visit these people are getting a first-hand experience around this. So I think, like I said earlier, this is probably the future of heritage education or history education, where people get to experience this firsthand, and also at the same time, it creates an impact for those local people who many of these dying trades are just dying out, and this will help create a dialogue within them and their families and their communities to keep it going on for future generations. These are some of the images. So this is a walk on the big image that you see on the left side was a walk done for little children from the age group of 9 to 14, who I found were very receptive of these storytelling walks, much more than older kids, because if I asked them a question, they would have 10 answers to give me, and they would really imagine and give you answers. And so this was a hands-on experience for them. They were actually pulling a net, a fishing net called the Chinese net, which is quite famous in Cochin. The second image on the right side on top is part of the type walk that we were doing, and we were examining these signboards that are now very rare, but these were done by sign painters over 5 or 6 decades, and now it's all getting replaced by digital signboards. The third and the last image that you see at the bottom was part of the tree walk, like I said earlier, where people could actually recollect childhood memories of being around trees and learning about them. And then they lost decades or years in between where they forgot all about this. Suddenly they came for this tree walk and got reminded about their childhood and their memories that they spent at maybe their grandparents' houses or their parents' houses. And many of them went back home and started sharing images of trees that they see in their daily life. So you can see Instagram getting flooded with trees, and then they tag us along with it when they spot a tree. So again, people falling in love with natural heritage just after coming for a tree walk. So these are the kind of experiences that I offer at the moment, and how I basically started archiving and documenting, and now I reach out to a much bigger audience through these walks that I do in my town. And I'm hoping to spread it around to more towns and cities in Kerala and in India in the future. And coming back to my main aim that you see in my website is actually adapted from a historical person from my city called A.B. Salem, who was a Jewish person who is from the Jewish community here. And he basically wrote these in his memoirs, and it became my main aim, where we want to stimulate a curious visitor to learn and carry away with them a deeper and broader understanding of the city's heritage, sufficient for them to enrich their mind while they engage with this. And then after that, it will cause them to pause and then look life from a new point of view and a new vision after the walk.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank
you so much for having me. I hope you got an idea about what I do, and I look forward to hear from the other panelists.
Really appreciate it. We would like to extend that in our conversation in the end, and talk more about these walks and what kind of input do they have in the long run of, larger ideas and policies and all of that? We can think and talk about those in later stage. Emmer, to you. Really excited to hear about you.
Thank you so much for having me on this. As I was saying before we started, it's a big honor for me. I've been following Alex's work for a long time, big fan of his work. Through this, I came across the Kochi Heritage Project as well, and just this presentation is really, really wonderful. And I'll be very honest, by my engagement with this, with what I do is more recent, and it actually started for like slightly silly reasons, if I'm completely honest. So this Khane Mein Kya Hai? This is basically something I started a year ago, less than a year ago, in which are basically food tours of Karachi. And they started, like my interest in food started basically because I was on Twitter a lot, and I'd be fighting with people from other cities about how amazing Karachi was. And I felt that a lot of times, like when we talk about, when we would, at least on Twitter, we would be fighting, and Karachiites would get a bit stuck because we don't, as we understand our history, we feel that it's not as ancient as like Lahore or Multan or whatever. It's not a pretty city. And I really hate it when people try and like frame Karachi in that evening sun and some sandstone building. And sure, there's beauty in it. I love the city, but I don't think that's the way forward. And I would think about what is the best burn I can do, and it would be Karachi's food is amazing. It's phenomenal, and it really showcases the city's diversity, which was one of the things I felt, particularly when you compare to other cities across Pakistan. Karachi is by far and away very unique because of the very, very diverse kind of population that lives there. And uh, that in that sense, understanding that diversity is not very easy. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Like when we talk about the built heritage of Karachi, it's a city that keeps devouring itself. It really doesn't respect its past in any which way. When you talk about education, now, there's this screen grab from the Herald, which is a Pakistani magazine, or was a Pakistani long form magazine, and they asked a bunch of historians about this question: what is the most blatant lie taught through Pakistan textbooks? And obviously, every country's official narrative is chock full of lies. Let's not get that wrong. But Pakistan does have a long-standing concern about being able to articulate its history and its the narrative for its being in a way that is coherent. And we don't really teach our history. So when I was studying Pakistan studies, we would come to the formation of Pakistan near the end of the 2-year kind of course in school. We really wouldn't talk about the history of the country a lot, which means that people have, at worst, a very fantastical mythology, and at best, even if they're questioning it, they have very incomplete pictures. What that means is that it becomes very difficult then to even talk about political history and to talk about political divisions, etc. And so my work, even before I got into food, I've worked with like, as I went, popular culture, worked a lot of music or sports, etc. The reason that those topics have always interested me is that they allow for some representation of people at the margins, and they allow the mainstream Pakistan to sort of step outside of his very extremely narrow kind of worldview that the state and society allows us to have. And so any form of culture really allows you to do that, and food is perhaps the most incredible example of that, simply because, again, in Pakistan, music itself is caught up in that debate of whether religion allows it or doesn't allow it. And then sports, even when you think cricket is a really, really popular sport, it's actually really limited to to areas of Pakistan that are very much part of the mainstream. Areas where cricket is not popular also tend to be areas where the state is absent from. But food is something that, like we don't have a lot of entertainment options in Pakistan, and so we really love it. And again, it's one of those areas that allows that diversity to come across. Now, when we were sent the abstract for this project, there was this quote that I really love, which was, "What is pertinent to this era is to recognize the ways that we can carry our history with ourselves into our day-to-day life." And that's something that really my research into looking at biryani in Karachi, that was something that really came across where a recipe in itself is an archive that carries with it a lot of different insights into why this food developed and why these certain decisions were made, etc. And then also because food is an area that once you talk about, like, okay, why does Karachi have biryani, is a question that really starts answering what was the impact of partition in 1947 on Karachi, right? When you talk about the communities that were in Karachi before partition, one way of really is now to find their cuisine in Karachi's restaurants, markets, streets, etc. I think one of my favorite ways of looking at it is talking about fish. Karachi is a city by the sea, but when you want to eat fish in Karachi, you'll get like, sushi, and you'll get like Norwegian style salmon or something like that. But you actually won't get fish caught off Karachi's coastlines cooked in the style that Karachi's indigenous communities made it in. And so that becomes a way of then further exploring um, the larger history, larger consequences of what we're talking about, right? So this is a picture of Amcham Goa. Amcham Goa is a family-run store by a Goan family that offers frozen Goan delicacies. They also have candies and sweets, etc. One of their main roles really is that as Karachi's Goan community has dwindled, a lot of their Christmas traditions, for example, or traditions around different festivals, was that the whole family would come together and make these very elaborate candies, fudges, cakes. And now, as the community has dwindled, a lot of them turn to Amcham Goa for creating those, or for giving them those, buying those candies from them around Christmas time, around that time of the year. And so that process of how, when you go to, when we do a food tour and we go to Amcham Goa and they talk about the past and they talk about the future, a kind of story that when we talk purely in political terms, people might not be open to understanding or open to relating to. They become a lot more open to it when they are eating that food. In fact, in general, anywhere that we've gone, when the people are eating, obviously, mehman nawazi, hospitality is such a big part of our culture. It softens a lot of those really kind of difficult boundary walls, right? So I think one way that a conversation I know I've tried to have a lot of times is that I'm from the name of my larger community keeps changing. So it's the Muhajirs or the Urdu speaking or whatever you want to call it, which is like the migrants who came from India. And because they were leaving behind their homelands, inbuilt into our politics and our social worldview is that look at how much we sacrificed for partition. Look at how much we sacrificed for Pakistan. So we land in Karachi and we absolutely erase everything else that was there in Karachi or push it to the sides, and our foods and our language and our cultural traditions are all over the city. And when you try and talk about the fact that, hey, man, I think, when you talk to another Muhajir about like this, the way that we erase the indigenous Sindhi speaking, Balochi speaking populations, and then even those later migrants such as the Goans, Parsis, um, Bodis, etc., people from the Kutchi area, etc. Um, then most Muhajirs are not interested in that conversation because it's just like, what are you talking about? We gave up our ancestral lands, and my grandfather was the IG or whatever the hell, right? And there's a lot of trauma around that, and it's difficult to get around that trauma or talk about, well, you're kind of the oppressor in this city right now, so maybe let's have that conversation. A way that I found I can have that conversation is once we've shared this meal, right? So that picture, if you go back to it right now, is on a boat in the mangroves. And this is a tour that we do with Karachi's Mahigir, as in the fisher folk community, the indigenous population of Karachi. And when we talk about, people are like, oh, how come I never, how come I can't eat this food in a restaurant? Because that community has no restaurants in the city. How come we don't eat fish from Karachi's harbors? And that kind of gives you an understanding of how Karachi's that demographic change led to culinary changes, led to the markets for fishes that were all over the city slowly disappearing or being reduced to one or two places that you get it from. And because they're eating, because there's hospitality involved, because um, there's an experience with that community that, as Johan was pointing out in his wonderful talk, that's sensory, that's putting you out in a place and interacting in a very real and tangible way. And you're getting some pleasure out of it, but that allows you to start thinking about it as well, right? And I think one of the things that, one of our panelists is from India, another from Iran, two countries that have done a fantastic job of at least having an idea of their heritage relatively, compared to Pakistan, where we've really struggled to articulate a coherent narrative, and because of that, we've really not taken an interest in examining our own past, because our own past then complicates our current narrative. So one of the ways that we that like we where I think Pakistan maybe has a bit of ground to cover is, a lot of times before you even talk about the value of this heritage, you have to explain the historical context of this heritage. Like, why is it important to preserve Karachi's oceanic character, for example? You have to first understand that that oceanic character was erased. When you don't even realize that, it's very difficult to get that conversation going. So again, I found that that using culture, using food in particular, is a really powerful way of kind of unlocking that way of talking to people, right? So this is something that allows us to when we go on these tours, it allows people to kind of break out of their preconceived notion. And in fact, one of the things that happens with Karachi in particular, and again, I'm sure it's true with Kochi or any other city as well, is obviously we're a very divided city by class as well. And a lot of the people who come on my tours, which are also priced in such a way that they're appealing to that population, is precisely because a lot of them talk about the fact that, oh, well, we never leave our part of the city, and we think about coming to this part of the city and having kachoris from Soldier Bazaar, or going to this mandir in Emigena Road, or having biryani from the north of the city in Water Pump. Is that this divide that's in class is ossified because of lots of other reasons as well. And again, talking about, you need to have a better relationship with the rest of your city, or you need to drop your privilege or whatever, is something that makes people uncomfortable. And people being uncomfortable is important, but an easier way to get them there is once they physically leave their bubble, so to speak, come to this part of town and then consume that food as well. Because again, like we do, Karachi has a bunch of other tours, and generally what people, are used to in some of these is just going there, posing in front or taking picture. We also have it's a huge, amazing YouTube and TikTok community of food bloggers. But again, a lot of that focus is on, I've come here, I'm eating this, and I liked it or I didn't like it, and they move on. So this is just an attempt to go one step further, to start talking to these people, these communities that are serving this food. When we go on these tours, usually the person who's the vendor or the restaurant owner or whatever is talking to the group. Several times we've seen that other people in the neighborhood are kind of like, okay, what's going on over here? And then they're like, by the way, let me tell you something about the Boris, or let me tell you something about Third Hindus, or let me tell you something about the Mahigir of Ibrahim Hedri. And that allows us to, it's not just that, okay, this is my tour, but then it starts creating these very basic kind of interactions that that are not happening in any other context. And so I don't want to oversell this. I think, like, we've seen this with other forms of culture as well, that they definitely allow downtrodden or marginalized communities a bit of moment in the spotlight. By that self, it's not going to change anything political anything structural. But it allows us to start having that conversation. It allows us to start pushing those boundaries and start getting people to realize that there's another world outside of their own experience. And I think, particularly in Karachi, particularly in Pakistan, just that kind of basic step is very, very important. And so a city like ours, where, as I mentioned at the start of my talk, so much of our heritage, our built heritage, our ecological heritage is being destroyed at a rate where, when you stop and think about it, it's just like you ought to, go to the airport and leave and delete your memories of Karachi. But the food, I feel, is such a wonderful way of archiving that, because it's constantly being created and recreated, and the debt it has, whether it's in terms of a technique or whether it's in terms of an ingredient, cannot be denied, right? And that's something that I think is one of those ways that, even though in our state, in our society, we keep trying to erase the past, or we keep trying to refashion the past, food is one of those ways that resists that. Because you can try and change your history books and make it a law that kids have to read it, and yeah, sure. But if you may change a recipe and it's not tasty, it's not going to work. And so I feel like that's one of that wonderful ways that food remains a form of archiving our heritage. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amir. That was really, really such a pleasure to go through that. I'm going to come back to your story of the Maigir, how that became like a popular one. So we'll come back to that in the last section of our discussion. Alex, eagerly waiting to hear from you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the panelists and the organizers as well. So thank you for having me on this panel today, which I really appreciate how it brings together different voices and perspectives from across borders in a region where I think we have all been deeply influenced by each other, but in which these connections have often been obscured or hidden from view, especially under the pressure of modern nationalism. So often our national narratives have called for a certain reading of history written from the power politics of the present, which centers the stories that legitimate those who are in power today, but which often obscures and covers up the stories that are not convenient or do not fit so neatly into our present day narratives, and that erases and downplays the connections that once connected us across the borders of today. It's important that we remember that history is always in the process of being written. What we receive in history books is a version of the story that was agreed upon by specific people based on a wide range of possible facts and stories that could have been included. But it can be changed and other stories can be written. And as a result, it's important for each of us to document the world around us to explore these other possibilities. As the theme of the panel speaks to, walking is a practice and a way to experience a city. But it's also a crucial way that can help us develop a counter archive, one that shows us stories that have been left out, avoided, or ignored. Today, I'll bring you some examples from a few cities across Iran of seemingly minor moments, sights, visions that appear that if you blink too quickly, you might miss. But if you pay attention, you start to see things that speak to deeper stories. So let's go on a walk. We start in Isfahan, in the central plains of Iran, and with an architectural tradition that is today regarded as quintessentially Iranian. It became the capital in the 1500s, and it is seen by Iranians as embodying the height of Persian culture and civilization. As it came to be developed as an imperial capital, it became home to people from all over. But today in the narrative of Isfahan, the mosques around Naqsh-e-Jahan Square take center place. And this is Naqsh-e-Jahan Square, which means the map of the world. And there's an expression about Isfahan that in Farsi that they say, if you've seen Isfahan, you've seen half of the world. And much of it refers kind of to this area. The story of Isfahan is so often told, however, in a way that really centers the space and centers this style of architecture. It's a story that focuses on Iran as a Muslim land, specifically given the conversion to Shiism by the Safavids in the 1500s. This is the heart of the classic tourist narrative of Isfahan, and one that really sits at the center of the Iranian national narrative of who Iran is and what takes center place in that story. But we get a very different version of this story if we look to the neighborhood of New Julfa, just across the river, which is the Armenian center of Isfahan, and is named after a village near the border with present-day Azerbaijan, but from which most of the Armenians of Isfahan originally came. And so you can see here, this is the central cathedral of New Julfa in Isfahan. This neighborhood is home today, until today, to the Armenian communities that became the center of a global trading network, the same Armenians who came to establish trading posts in Madras and Hong Kong, in Singapore, Manila, and in many other cities, using Isfahan and the neighborhood of New Julfa in particular as a base. New Julfa's history is today spread across the world, but its churches and its back alleys offer a very different version of Iran, one that tells a very different story than the national narratives tend to center, of a multi-religious empire with a global span through trading networks that were engineered and managed by Armenian merchants. None of these churches would have been possible, nor the amazing and gorgeous decorations inside them would have been possible to create without that global trading network that spanned far beyond Iran's borders. But these today stand as, the churches today stand as testament to the neighborhood's massive reach in the past, which is so often left out of the story we tell about Isfahan as an Iranian capital and as the embodiment of Iranian tradition, but which is so much contained within Iran's borders in a way that the past was not, and which these churches and this neighborhood in general really tells us a very different version of that story. Armenians continue to live in Isfahan and are a significant community in the city's daily life today. As a result, there are museums as well as these churches which attract visitors and to a certain extent can tell that story to those who wander in that direction. But the influence of this history can also be seen in other ways, in the interactions that occurred between communities in Isfahan. For example, in some of the lesser known Muslim shrines in Isfahan, in which you have traditions of figural representation, particularly of the family of the Prophet Muhammad, which are extremely common and point to an artistic synergy that developed in part in conversation with Armenian figural art, and which these smaller shrines located, across Isfahan's urban fabric have been subjected to, they espouse different versions of norms of religious orthodoxy than you might find at the large in the large central mosques in Isfahan, and which also reveal a very different relationship about the historic, a very different story about the historic relationship between Islam and art than is usually taught even in textbooks about Islamic art, for example. But this is something that is kind of hidden and embedded in the city's urban fabric, but which is generally ignored in the stories we tell about the history. Indeed, it is on walks through Isfahan's bazaar and unknown corners that this cosmopolitan history of the city really reveals itself. For example, the large Jewish community, which, if you notice on the left side, there's a menorah, and it's written in Hebrew on the top in the same row as the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And on the right side, there's an image of Moses. And these traces kind of the long history of the Jewish community in Iran, as well as their influence, particularly in tile making, means that you can find these hidden traces that speak to that community's presence as well as history in ways that are, again, not often told as a central part of the story. But what about those communities that have disappeared from the urban fabric? Those that may have made a place their home, that made Isfahan their home in the past, but no longer exist in the present. For those, we have to look a little bit harder sometimes for more whisper traces. And one of the interesting ways kind of in the process of walking that you can encounter these is through the street names or area designations that we may never have considered the stories that they reveal. For example, in Isfahan, in one of the back parts of the bazaar, there's a Sarai Hinduha, which means like the bazaar of the Indians or the Hindus, because that word can mean either. And today it's a refrigerator bazaar, but the name points to this history, and it points to the fact that this was a bazaar that was extremely multinational and very global in reach, and that at the height of Isfahan's time as the imperial capital, the bazaar once hosted a community of tens of thousands of South Asians who used Isfahan as a center from which they spread across much of the Middle East and up into Russia as well, a network of South Asian merchants that for whom Isfahan was one of the central nodes in that network. And across Iranian cities, there are many bazaars where there are streets that have similar names that point to this lost geography. And I think we often talk of the Persian presence in South Asia or the influence of Iran in South Asia, we so rarely think about South Asian presence in Iran as well as the influence of that history in the other direction. And it's a story that's very much been left out of Iran's national narrative, which is today so much defined by the borders on either side. But Until the early 20th century, there was this network of South Asian merchant communities across Iran's large and small cities. But the traces have almost been completely obscured, in part because so few South Asians live in Iran today to tell the story. Because the community left, the history has been almost completely erased from history books and stories of national identity. But in the urban fabric, we can see these traces at times. There are other kinds of objects in the urban sphere that can also point to historical and political realities beneath the surface, often to more recent histories that have been suppressed. And that can also highlight political possibilities of the past that no longer exist in the present. For example, a few blocks from my home in Tehran, there was a faded poster on one of the walls that I never really paid attention to. And then at the beginning of the COVID lockdowns, when we could kind of go outside and there was a lot more time just to wander and no one was around, it caught my eye in a way that it never had before. And as I looked closer, I began to realize that this was actually a poster from the first and one of the few really relatively free elections in Iran's history in 1979, immediately following the revolution, when there was a brief moment of freedom in which, before the authoritarian regime really consolidated power, but in which there were leftist and socialist parties, for example, in the parliament. And so as I looked at the poster closely and started to do research, I realized that this was for an Armenian candidate for parliament, Khair Khalatyan, whose poster, as you can see, is written in both Persian and Armenian, which would be very common, would be very uncommon in public space today, and who was running on a leftist platform of social equality. His family was actually descended from Armenians who fled the genocide in Ottoman Turkey and found a refuge in Iran. And by the early 1980s, just a few years after this poster was put up, leftist candidates would be largely forbidden from running in Iranian elections. But this poster was a hint, a memory of this past that has been completely taken out of Iranian textbooks today, of a moment of political possibilities very different from the situation that we have in the present. Last year, this building was demolished, and these photos are now some of the few records that we have of this poster and how that memory of the past persisted into the present, as well as of that past. And I know I want to make sure we have time for conversation and for questions. So I'm just going to conclude my talk by moving to a space that connects the three panelists in a different way, through the sea. The studies and descriptions of Iranian architecture so often prioritize Isfahan, and they're very much connected through this concept of Central Asian architecture in conversation with Mughal architecture, but is very much in Iranian history based on the elaborated imperial style of the Safavids, as we saw earlier. But in Iran, as anywhere else, there are many different architectural styles that are very different region by region, and which point to histories and connections that might not be bounded by the nation state. So this is the city of Bushehr on the Persian Gulf Coast, which flourished in the 1800s and was once the preeminent port city of the Persian Gulf, long before Dubai or Doha or Kuwait or any of these that today are more well known. Bushehr was the heart also of the British imperial network in the 1800s across the Persian Gulf, and it was governed at times from India through the British Empire. The architecture of Bushehr has very little in common with that of Isfahan, as you can see from these pictures, or of the Iranian heartland in general, as it's often spoken of. But it is reminiscent of a myriad other cities around the Indian Ocean, like Zanzibar, Mombasa, Limu, Muscat, Aden, and many other places. In the use of limestone, wooden shutters, it betrays these connections across the sea. And it also speaks to different cultural norms around architecture that are embedded in the architecture. I mean, in which, unlike traditional, what is usually considered traditional classic Iranian architecture, which is very inward focused, these buildings, it's inward focused and organized around interior courtyards. These buildings have interior courtyards, but they also have this outward looking face towards the sea, which reveals not only a focus on privacy in terms of the inward lookingness, but also an openness to the sea and to the outside, which speaks also to different cultural norms than those of the Central Desert Plains. This style of architecture it has been seen as irrelevant to the idea of Iran that has come to be dominating in the history books and the art books and the way we talk about heritage in Iran today, which is so much defined by borders and this idea of the 16th century imperial style based on the capital. And as a result, it's largely been left to decay. The old city of Bushehr, about a third of it has collapsed, a third of it is abandoned, and a third of it is still being used, which is where the pictures I'm showing you are from. But its continued existence and the documentation of these buildings and the architecture and the history points to how much the history of Bushehr and the south of Iran in general are tied to South Asia, to East Africa, and to this entire world of the coasts. And although it has largely been abandoned by heritage institutions in Iran, for whom this doesn't quite fit the model of Iranian heritage that they seek to prioritize, it's largely individuals who are shouldering today the work of preserving and documenting these areas to ensure that they're remembered and that hopefully they persist, but also that they'll be remembered and studied in the present as well as in the future. And with that, I conclude my talk. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, all the panelists. This was great. I mean, to go through variation over here with our panel today, especially with thinking about archives, walking and documenting. Just to conclude and kind of like create a synopsis here, while there were some people who joined us a little later. I would like to bring in a kind of like a overarching, summary, where Kochi Heritage talks about these educational tours, various kind of walks, and understanding the city through that by categorizing it by talking about tree walks, typography walks, sketch walks. What does it do when you kind of create these kind of categories and have a conversation around that? And then moving towards, Emma's conversation around, very apt thinking on class divide and thinking about history, thinking about the narrative and not dwelling over nostalgia or romanticism, but like moving forward, but also understanding the complexities when it comes to heritage and thinking cities. Alex, your work, the last part really reminded me of our first session that we held with one of our speakers who talked about Gwadar's architecture, and it really had those influence. One could see the connection with East Africa, Zanzibar, and that kind of architecture of outwards and bringing the sea and the coast into the space making. But of course, the idea of disappearing communities and talking about these obscure traces. I will open up a question here for all three of you, and you can jump in and maybe we can start off with Emma and Alex, both of you. Talk quite like similar complexities of cities, thinking about national identity, and then how that plays such a role in bringing communities. Their information is kind of lost. So when you are studying or documenting cities or researching, what comes as a point of query to you in your work?
Well, I think there's some a lot of times the national narrative is basically looking to snuff out every other narrative that exists, right? That's one of the major purposes for it. And and obviously it has the law and violence of the state to be able to enforce it. But really the question, as I said before, is it's a question of how coherent is that narrative, right? And if the narrative is too incoherent, then the state will struggle to kind of be able to get people to rally around it or get people to have at least some kind of buy-in into it. And in fact, in that, food is a really interesting thing because it goes both ways. So if you talk about biryani, which is one of my great passions, biryani is a food that historically is not associated with any of the regions of most of the regions of Pakistan. But it's after 1947, you have that migration and biryani comes over here, except the people who come over here are very instrumental in developing the national narrative for Pakistan. And so even the biryani is a dish that's largely kind of something that these communities have. It ends up being seen as a Pakistani dish. And at first I was completely, convinced that this is something that the migrants from India had brought with them, except then further research showed that the coastal communities of Karachi have had versions of what we would understand as a biryani that predate partition and the influence of all these communities. And in fact, when you actually tear down the history of biryani itself, there's most of the results on Google will say that the Muslims brought biryani Muslim royalty brought biryani to the subcontinent, except when you look at the South and the development of biryani there, that theory is challenged. And increasingly, we're realizing that it's these maritime links across the Indian Ocean that this mix basically of like using meat and cooking it with fat and rice is something that you see in all these different communities and being shared, and those recipes being developed. So biryani is this double-edged sword where when you pull apart at its history, it really undoes the national and colonial narratives around what the subcontinent is. Yet at the same time, it is also a dish that the Pakistani state has been able to impose as this idea of a Pakistani dish, even though that's a rather ahistorical idea.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was a great answer, and I think I agree that food is such an interesting way to kind of bring these stories to the fore. I mean, for me, I think part of the center of the investigation I do is it's also about really prioritizing the local as the center of politics, of stories, of people's experiences. And I think there's this tendency to scale up and to think bigger is better, and to tell these stories that really encompass as much as possible. But in the process of scaling up, we're forced to homogenize the stories we're telling. And I think our experiences, our daily experiences of life, of our identity, of the world around us is so much rooted in the places we're based in neighborhoods and in everyday interactions we have with people around us. And so I think looking to those stories, looking to the places that people live in is really a powerful way to open up these contradictions in these larger national narratives that are based on this much larger scale. And it kind of becomes a way to help people start questioning those homogenous narratives and kind of look around at things that they've taken for granted and make them realize, how much is hidden in plain sight, which I think something like the heritage walks is probably a very effective way to do that. Because it creates a space to open up those contradictions. And I think once the first contradictions are opened up, once people start realizing that, okay, these are narratives, and those narratives are actually quite different from the reality of everyday life, and that everyday life itself can be a place of investigation. It can be a place full of that if you have curiosity towards it, it can actually open up these new stories. I think once you start asking those questions to begin, it really the entire narrative begins to crumble, or it opens up the space to really begin thinking through other questions that you might not have considered, which is why it's so powerful, I think, to think about the built environment and walking through heritage and looking at the everyday kind of as a site of investigation.
Thanks, Alex. I mean, I'm going to read out a question and I'll open up to the audience. I mean, you can just, jump in and please ask a question. There's a question here for Juan. In Karachi, there are many people who don't like to walk in heritage areas due to pollution or lack of walkability of the area. There must be similar situations in your region. Is this something that's conceived as a problem for your walking participants? Is there a way of solving it in your context? And the second question is for Emma. Do you think indigenous cuisine you mentioned should become commercial? Would that be a positive impact on communities, or would it become a way of exploitation? So we'll come to Emma, but Juan, if you would like to respond to the idea of like the politics of walking, where it's not feasible, what do you think? Thanks, Sab Akbar, for the question.
Thank you for that interesting question. So I haven't really faced a situation where people haven't been willing to walk or come on a walking tour because there's pollution or there's dirt around. Many times I find individuals who are basically open-minded to come for these tours, and then their perspectives have changed after the walk is over, and so they become even more open-minded once they see the place and they see that there's a historical narrative and there's an importance to this place where over 500 years many people came and went. They find they don't have many of these problems that you generally find, like about pollution, the streets being dirty, and they actually go ahead and bring more people for these walks again, so that people can actually see the true face of the city with its in the eyes of heritage.
Saba, I mean, if one has to think about the from our part of the region, walking itself is quite it's a space that you have to make, and I can understand where this query is coming from. Like footpaths is a very contested space. But then, if walking and history and all of that is part of that context, you got to work it out in some way or the other. So
just to
kind of
add,
finding a solution, I feel like footpaths is an urban space that one needs to think about in planning, and has to. I mean, this is something that's really like forgot in this part of the region where Karachi, footpath is a square foot area for a commercial activity. So yes, it opens up into a whole new dialogue and a conversation. Maybe we should have a session on that for these contested spaces. Sorry, Juan, you were saying something.
Yeah, just to add to that. So I time my walks at a time when there are less people around. So like one of the walks that I do is basically focusing on the colonial history and the area where the colonials were. And so I do that walk very early in the morning. So there aren't many people around and people can actually see the place for its architectural beauty. But at the same time, I do, like you said, much more dirtier and maybe clean space. And I do it at a time what life is about and what how the local people move around in the spaces. And that's basically understand the realities of that place. So just to add to that.
Thanks. Emmer?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Sabha. It's one that I grapple with myself also. And I think it ties back to what I was saying earlier, where, when we talk about food or we talk about like culture as entry points into understanding deeper political things, as I said, like there's a limit to it, and it is possible to depoliticize these things as well, right? So I feel that it is true for even like musicians who come on Coke Studio or something. The same is true for like this indigenous cuisine. That if the entities, the organizations that are profiting from it commercially are not the ones that that are not run by the community that creates this cultural artifact, then obviously you'll have exploitation. And so I think like that's one of those things where it's very important that when we are engaging with these communities, we're thinking about what kind of structural impact we're having as well. What kind of engagement we're having, and then when we are looking to like sell this as a like my tours or something that you pay for, then what kind of relationship at a commercial and material sense I have with that community as well. Because if I'm really just using them as token figures and giving them a token amount or whatever, and using that exploitation, then of course this is something that can go in a very unfortunate kind of exploitative way. But at the same time, if you're going like that, I think the answer isn't then okay, then we shouldn't do anything commercial. Like obviously capitalism sucks, etc. But I'm not trying to justify that. But once we are engaging in this kind of world, it makes no sense for these communities to be so disenfranchised. And if finding them sustainable ways of income is a way of increasing their social mobility, their political access, then I think we need to work towards that. And that's where, to answer your other question about pollution as well, when we do tours, so I make people agree to this like little statement, which is like you're not going to complain about the pollution or the overflowing gutter or whatever the environment as it is. You need to engage with it. You're also not allowed to take pictures of poor people, because I think one of the main reasons people go on these walks is like, look at this man with a lot of wrinkles on his face, and I've taken a black and white iPhone picture. Like none of that, because again, you kind of flatten these people or these cultures as just something that's an adornment, that's something that's exotic. So you have to ask permission for taking pictures, because once you're asking permission, you're engaging with them as a human being rather than an aesthetic item to put on your Instagram feed. So I think, as Johan also pointed out, when you have to obviously adjust, okay, I'll do it on a Sunday and I'll do it when traffic is less, etc. But whatever engagement that you have, it can't be a very flat engagement. It can't be that, okay, we've had, take a look, let's get out of here. It has to contend with it. So if pollution is an issue, we have to think about why is it that, well, actually, even the rich parts of Karachi are really polluted. So maybe that's even a larger conversation, like why is Karachi such a mess?
Thank you. If there are any other questions by the audience, please jump in. I know Josefa does, so go ahead, Josefa.
Yes, hello. I had a question specifically for Emmer, like as he talked about in his slides, how Muhajirs came in and into Karachi, and in a way they covered over the indigenous food history. I also wanted to I wanted him to shed some light on how Muhajirs themselves covered over their own food history and how they have made this ethnicity called Muhajirs, which is like a blanket term that is very genocidal in itself, in how it lumps in people who ethnically, like in a way, like Nihari more, and like people who ethnically like Rabri more, and how that history itself has also been overlooked in how they aren't owning up to it in a way. I wanted more insight.
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I'll give you an answer that's not to do with food, because it's something I discovered recently myself. Karachi has a huge procession on the 10th of Muharram, Ashura, which is a very important day for Shia Muslims in particular. All I don't want to speak for other sects. And there's this huge procession that goes through the historic length of the city. The Julus itself is an archive of post-partition Karachi, and it incorporates different troops from like southern Punjab or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or Gilgit-Baltistan, etc., that are doing some different kind of practices. But there is a kind of understanding that the practices in that Julus are orthodox Pakistani Shia practices, but most of them are actually from Lucknow and the kind of high culture from that particular state and that region, which really kind of developed. And it was only this year when I went to attend the end, like it starts from the historical edge of the city to the port, and you go through the historical neighborhoods of Kharadar. And I'd never gone to that part of the Julus. So when you go there, you see the communities there that are pre-partition communities. Their Muharram procession is very different. It involves like brass cymbals and involves drums. And it has a lot in common with both practices. You go this way across Balochistan and across the Makran coast in Oman and Iran, or you go down this way towards Maharashtra. There's practices that they've picked up from both these communities as well. So yes, when this was a way in which, like, what was a specific part of North India, its culture became to stand in for like the whole of that population, and then for the whole of that population in Karachi as well. And so I think yes, like, and you see that in food as well, that there is biryani is actually, it is not perhaps something that all of people from North India are having, or a lot of these dishes that are also associated with festivities and with royal kitchens, etc., have become like staples, something that you're eating every day in the house, when they were usually cooked like once a year or whatever. And those local vegetables or local kind of dishes that different communities had have disappeared because of that. But I think again, that question really speaks to also how societies have had to grapple with the realities post-colonialism, right? And you'll see these kinds of, as you said, like genocidal or eraser kind of identity constructs created as a response to the trauma, to the fallout of that. And I do hope that it's something that we can now start unpacking, and again, food is a great way of doing that. One of the journalists I met has been documenting the food history of her family from a particular part of northern India, and in that it kind of creates a distinct identity from the homogenizing term of Muhajir or Urdu speaking. So perhaps there is time using food as well to kind of undo some of this damage.
Thank you so much, Emmer. Aksa, do you want to jump in and ask a question, or anybody else?
Yeah, I do have a question for Alex, but I'd be happy if Emmer or Johan also want to answer this. My question is basically about the practice of independent archiving as a response to modern nationalism. Just like you spoke of modern nationalism, how it dominates the historical narratives and the cultural narratives, and how it kind of obscures the nuances that are there between different communities, the exchanges, the historical exchanges. So I would like you to comment on how do you view the practice of independent archiving as a response to modern nationalism?
I think, thanks for that question. I think independent archiving is so important. I think both in terms of kind of contradicting the narratives that modern nationalism has created, as well as the way it's homogenized identity, which is, I think, a story in many different places, right? But also particularly in contexts where, like Iran, where there's also a great deal of political repression. And so it's not just that there's a national story that kind of excludes these narratives, but there's also pressure not to challenge the national narrative that's enforced in different ways. It's also enforced in, for example, how the official archives remove certain stories. They remove many narratives. And in those kinds of contexts, really the only way to build a counter narratives is by building this kind of counter archive. And I think one of the things that we've been wrestling with is how do you build those archives in sustainable ways, particularly when you don't have the kind of access to funds and institutions that the national institutions have or official institutions have. And so I don't think there's necessarily a good answer, but at Agile Media Collective, we started trying to build an archive that was very much focused on everyday life, on everyday practices, and part of the use of that, I think, is also bringing out the stories and the objects that exist in our homes that are passed on, but really remain private. But so often those private stories can tell these other stories that really contradict what the official narratives allow, and so. I think it's difficult, but I think it's also important to figure out how to archive it, how to protect those memories, and then there's always limits to it as well. I mean, I think of the poster on the wall, and I think of how for 40 years, for 43 years, that was standing. I think it was probably ignored by most people, myself included, until I took a better look. And now it's gone forever. And I don't think I don't know if there are posters like that anywhere else. But for me, it's the fact of documenting it means that it can continue to tell stories. And I think in that sense, I think it is important for us to be developing these independent archives, whether or not we know what to do with it in the present, but to try and be able to tell these stories over time. And even just like the ability for me right now to share that poster with you all is a kind of creating an afterlife for an object that no longer exists.
Thank you so much, Alex. Bala, would you like to ask this question directly from Emir?
Yes, sure. I guess great session. So I was just curious because this pre and post partition, that narrative did appear in some of those stories when you mentioned Emir. So and I would imagine Karachi being this very multicultural coastal city, its dynamics probably has changed a lot after that. So is that very stark that you see pre-partition and post-partition? And specifically, where have people migrated to Karachi from? Is there some sort of, is there a story around that?
Yeah, in fact, it's drastic because Karachi goes from being, as I said, like I brought this up, and this is something I'm researching myself further. But basically, Karachi was always an oceanic city. It was a city defined by its relationship to the water, and so even the people who migrated pre-partition are, as you point out, this is broadly speaking, like you've got from the west, there's a connection through Balochistan with the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. Further down south with Africa, trade winds meant that like on the east coast of Africa, there was a big connection with the communities that are living over here. And then obviously down the west coast of India, in particular from Gujarat, there's multiple communities from Gujarat, from Maharashtra, from Kerala, all the way down as well, that populated Karachi prior to independence. Post 1947, Karachi's migration patterns switch from being maritime to being land-based. So it's your basically areas where the Muslim peak was popular. So a lot of like central northern India, Hyderabad, and then United Provinces, Lucknow, Meerut, Delhi, etc. They come over to Karachi. And then since then, particularly in the 50s, especially after the Soviet invasion, a lot of Pashtun-speaking migrants. By some estimates, Karachi is the largest Pashtun city in the world, if not, is very close to Peshawar and Kabul in terms of its Pashtun population. And then from southern Punjab as well, another very disenfranchised part of Pakistan. A lot of the migration from southern Punjab comes down to Karachi. And as I point, all of these are overland, right? So that has, in a lot of ways, changed the city's character. And as we've been talking about, it's kind of layered the city. Like, it's not like the pre-partition part of the city has disappeared, but it is, you have to kind of pry all these other layers that have come in that time. And in fact, one of the ways that food kind of really shows this is that, as I mentioned earlier, that fish, particularly once it was possible to export fish on refrigerated planes, Karachi's fish actually mostly goes towards Singapore, China, and Japan. And it's because a lot of these new people were not coming from coastal areas, so they're not interested in saltwater fish. And so now in Karachi, you can actually get amazing cuisine from Kabul and Peshawar. You can get lamb tikkas that would rival Kissa Khani Bazaar in Peshawar, but you will struggle to find mushka or the local prawns being cooked in a local way. And that's one of those ways that city's character has changed over the last 75 years.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bala, for the question, and thanks, Emmer, for the response. As I always say, that we can continue this conversation, and it's my promise is always on a weekday or a weekend, we will not go more than 1.5 hours of this conversation, because, it's late at night and people are waiting for dinner. So we would like to now conclude the session, but if you have any questions, please email us, and we would love to carry on this dialogue. We have next 2 sessions left in this webinar series. The next one is the feminist lens of mapping the city, and the last one is understanding heritage through ethical tourism. All these sessions will be uploaded on the YouTube, so you can always go back and share it with your students, institutes, friends, whoever would be interested to hear the South Asian perspective on heritage and built environment. Thank you again, panelists. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here. And this was quite a thing that we have achieved, to have you 3 on this. So thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it.